Welcome. Welcome to Summer Team International Authors and International Stories. I hope you're enjoying the Summer Team Conference so far. I'm Susan Stan, and I'm happy you've joined us for this panel. I'll introduce the panelists in a moment, but first I need to take care of a few technical items. You got to make sure that the pop-up blockers are turned off. If you're experiencing technical problems, which is always a possibility, please use the red Q&A button at on the audience console, and a technical person will help you. If your screen becomes locked due to the local network congestion, if you're on a PC, press F5. If you're on a Mac, Command R. The slide presentation that you're about to see will be available for download in the green resources folder at the bottom of the menu dock. A certificate for continuing education credit is also available in the resources folder, and it's labeled certificate. Check for other resources here, and don't forget to visit our sponsors booth for lots of goodies and giveaways. This webcast will be archived and available for on-demand viewing in about 72 hours, and then it will be accessible for 90 days or 3 months. We'll reserve the last 20 minutes or so for questions. So if you have questions or comments for any of our panelists, send those in anytime via the Q&A button, the red Q&A box that is at the bottom of your console. It's doubtful that we'll make it through all the questions, so the panelists will answer some of those after the fact, and you can watch for a follow-up email in the next couple of weeks. Of course, you can follow us on Twitter. You can find us at SLJ event, hashtag SLJST. And now, for the reason that you're here, please these four fascinating authors and learn a little bit about their books. We're coming to you. You can see we have a truly international panel. We're coming to you from a number of different places. From left to right, joining us are Elizabeth Stewart from Vancouver, British Columbia, Kat Beyer from Madison, Wisconsin, Tanuja Desai from London. However, she's joining us from Massachusetts today as she flew to the U.S. a couple of days ago. And Michael Williams from Cape Town, South Africa. And not to get too confusing, he's joining us from London for reasons that will become apparent when I introduce him much later on. We'll hear from each of the panelists one by one, and then the whole question and answer session will be at the end. So, the first presenter is Elizabeth Stewart. She's long been writing for teens and tweens, but not necessarily in print form. She's worked in the medium of television. Her career began with the CBC as a researcher and producer on current affairs segments. And then, when she moved to the West Coast, she started in on another career as a dramatic screenwriter for television. She has written a number of scripts for award-winning television series for children, and all of her content is Canadian. Her work relates to Canadian authors, Canadian children and Canadian culture. Because of her film work, Atlantic Press asked her to write about an event that happened in the 19th century involving a 14-year-old First Nations boy. And that book became The Lynching of Louis Sam. She's following that up with Blue Gold, a contemporary story that has just been published. It spans 3 parts of the globe and 3 perspectives. And believe me, you will never look at your cell phone in the same way again after hearing about this or reading this book. Elizabeth, take it away.
Thank you, Susan. Well, blue gold, the title refers to coltan. It's a rare mineral, columbite tantalite ore that is used in electronics. As Susan said, there are 3 narratives in my book. We follow 3 15-year-old girls living on 3 different continents, but each of their lives has been deeply affected, for better or worse, by a cell phone. There's Sylvie in Africa, who's been forced to flee the eastern Congo with her family due to conflict over the mining of coltan in that country. She is now living in Tanzania in a refugee camp. There's Lei Ping, who's working in an electronics factory in Shenzhen, China. And there's Fiona, who's living in Vancouver, who makes an unfortunate choice one evening with her cell phone, with a certain photograph she takes of herself that gets out on social media. So my intent in writing this book was, well, actually I asked myself many times during the writing why I was writing this book. But in this news cycle we're in at the moment, with the horrors going on around the world, I'm reminded that I was reading about the plight of especially young girls and women around the world, and I felt helpless, and I wanted somehow to express their stories in a way that would be open to youth in where I live, in Canada and in the United States, I hope. So those are my reasons for writing the book. I will hand it back to Susan now.
Okay, thanks so much, Elizabeth. We'd love to hear more from you in the question and answer series. I'm curious about a number of things about that book, which is really a terrific read. Our next presenter is Kat Beyer. Kat made her publishing debut in 2012 with The Demon Catchers of Milan. Oops. Here she is. And it's a contemporary story that features a 16-year-old American girl of Italian ancestry who, for reasons that our author will no doubt get into, ends up going to Milan to live with an extended family that she had never met before. Kat has experience as a very fine artist, and this really translates well into her ability to paint with words and bring both Milan and her characters to life. The bulletin of the Center for Children's Books called this book A Love Letter to Milan, and SLJ noted that its premise, and I should add that it's a supernatural book, and in this age when supernatural books, novels are really abundant, SLJ picked it out as a book that had a fresh premise that was fresh and worthy of note. So the story continues in the second book, The Demon Catchers of Milan, The Halcyon Bird. I'd like Kat to tell us more about this world that she's created. Take it away, Kat.
Hi. The story really began actually as a title without a book. I thought of the title while I was walking along the cliffs of the Ligurian coast above Rio Maggiore in Italy just after Y2K. I just thought, The Demon Catchers of Milan. We'd been wandering around Milan, my friend Michelle and I, after snowboarding, and I was like, wow, what a great title for a story. I had also, a little bit less recently, about 7 months before, Michelle and I had been in town in March, walking down the Via Fiori Chiari, which is in the Brera district of Milan. And it was a cold night. There were a lot of folks out breathing frost, and we passed a little candle shop with flames flickering in the windows, kind of beckoning us inside. Standing in the doorway was a Milanese man in a beautifully cut suit, and he was just kind of leaning against the door, watching the people, and walking up the street towards him, clearly headed towards him, were 3 people, 2 younger, classic, dark-haired Italians with very dark eyes and olive skin, obviously brother and sister, and kind of fallen star beautiful, and they were just lovely. And next to them, a luminous young man, just like Apollo, and he eventually became Emilio in the book. So watching those people, that little image stayed with me, melded with the title, and that was the seed for the novel. The other sort of threads running through the novel come from my own life, but I didn't really realize that until after I wrote the book. I tend to, this is going to sound like sloppy practice, but it isn't. I tend to write first from an outline, work on everything, and then afterwards kind of look at where it came from. And a friend of mine commented after she read a first draft of the novel that this family that I'd written about sounded a lot like my own family. Now, I'm not of Italian ancestry, but I do have this giant family that meets every year on a piece of land in the Northeast. And I know all of my second and third cousins. I know our family history back many generations, and I didn't realize that that was really informing the book. The other thread that's kind of running through the book is my main character Mia's experience of a new culture, a foreign culture, a culture with a different language and habits. She may be descended from it, but she's really cut off from it in a lot of ways in the United States. And so entering that culture, learning about it, little details and big, like, for example, just a small thing, in the U.S., cold water faucets are marked with a C, right, for cold. Well, in Italy, the word for hot is calda, so all the hot water faucets are marked with a C. And so just tiny things like that Amia has to get used to, changes from freezing cold water to boiling hot. And I think that's maybe a little bit of her experience there. Other threads would be, I have a degree in medieval history from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. That was one of my foreign cultures that I experienced, although I spent more time with a foreign language when I was in France and in Italy. And so just the pace of human history, our best guesses about the past, and the demons that we wake up by our actions, particularly many of our recent actions in the last 100 years. Yeah, I think that's probably the big picture for the book. I am, of course, in love with Italian food and culture and history, and it was great fun to write about all of it. So I look forward to completing the third book. I'm writing it right now, and the second one is more of the same with a deepening of Mia's experience in Milan thrown in. Okay, back to you, Susan, and thank you so much for your time. I'm really looking forward to reading everyone's books, by the way.
Thanks, Kat. We're moving on now to our woman from London/Massachusetts. Tanuja Desai EDA is a writer and a singer-songwriter. She was born in the United States and raised in the United States, but now lives in London. Her first novel, Born Confused, follows Dimple Lala, the American-born only child of parents who immigrated from India during a formative summer after her junior year in high school. That is to say, it follows her during that formative summer. Her parents didn't immigrate after that formative summer. Quoting from the book's back cover, this is a story about finding yourself, finding your friends, finding love, and finding your culture, sometimes where you least expect it. Dimple is really a great character. She has a great sense of humor, a wry voice, and after 12 years, she's finally back in a second book, Bombay Blues. Tanuja, will you tell us more about this?
Yes. Can you hear me? So yes, the Born Confused is my first book, and the sequel, Bombay Blues, comes out next month. And I've also made 2 albums of original songs based on these books, which I call book tracks. And Bombay Spleen, which is the album of original songs based on Bombay Blues, is also out next month. The issues of setting are interesting and very vital ones to the telling of these stories for me, to the point that I'd say that the setting is a kind of character in each book. New York City for Born Confused, and Bombay, or a kind of, as she comes to call it, Dimple comes to call it, un-Bombay for Bombay Blues. Born Confused is set in New York City, where I lived for many years. Bombay Blues is set in Bombay, a city I didn't know very well until I embarked on this project, even though it's the city where my mother was born, my brother was born, where my parents met in medical school, and the city of their courtship. For me, it was more a metropolis of myth and distant memory, but one that evoked a very strong sense of nostalgia, even though I'd never really known it. Interestingly, I wrote both books after moving to London, and with Born Confused, I was living on Portobello Road in West London. The next street up from where our flat was Lancaster Road, and that became Dimple's best friend Gwyn's street name in New Jersey in the book. And both of my book track albums were made with musical co-writers who live in London, New York, and Belgium, so thank God for, the internet and all of that to help pull it together. So Born Confused is a South Asian American coming-of-age story that follows aspiring photographer Dimple Lala through summer that basically turns her world on its head as she tries to figure out how to bring her two cultures together. The title comes from ABCD, or American Born Confused Desi, which is a term South Asians in South Asia have created for these second-generation kids who are supposedly confused about where they come from. With Born Confused, I was interested in exploring, in part, the idea of what happens when a subculture gains critical mass and momentum to become culture. And I wanted to pay homage to the thrilling Bhangra South Asian club scene in New York City that started to develop in those years, one that was inextricably linked to the amazing cultural moment in music coming out of the UK in '97, with the Asian underground, things like Anoka, State of Bengal, Talvin Singh, Asian Dub Foundation. At the same time, in the late 90s in New York City, South Asian Studies departments were forming, South Asian student associations, the South Asian Women's Creative Collective came into being, and in the space of one summer, I met more South Asians than I'd ever known in my life, up to all kinds of creative mischief. In New York, it was DJ Rekha's Basement Bhangra party, still going strong after 17 years, and her party called Mutiny, held at a place called The Cooler, that in many ways sparked the desire to tell the story of this cultural moment in New York. It was an eye and ear opening experience living it. And through Dimple, I wanted to take that C for confused in the ABCD moniker and change it to creative, as that felt to me, an American-born creative Desi, is to more accurately reflect this scene and the Desis that peopled this world in New York, who I was meeting. I wanted to turn that neither here nor there space into a you are here, as Dimple herself learns that a hyphenated identity is also a whole identity. With Bombay Blues, it was a completely different story. I'd only lived in Bombay for about a year shortly after birth. I'd visited a few times in my childhood, stayed with my grandparents mostly. The city was a mystery, but it still somehow felt like a mystery that was in my blood, quite literally, because of my family's connection to it. And with this book, I think I was really driven by a desire that was almost a duty, in a sense, to better know the city of my parents and try to forge my own connection to it. And though, of course, I wanted to explore culture and the idea of being brown among the brown, as well as place, and the cultural shifts happening within a globalized Bombay, as well as its many coexisting ancient aspects, even more than that, I wanted to move beyond questions of culture, or at least that kind of framework, and sort of step out of frame, enter a more ambiguous state, in part through Dimple's trajectory there as an artist and that of her heart. Dimple travels to Bombay to shoot The Browns, or so I thought when I began this book. But as I spent more time there, to my surprise and delight, blue began to overwhelm, initially in terms of actual sightings of that hue in Bombay, and then that hue became the clue to my book and led me to the idea of exploring the bigger blue, the blue of music, of mood, the wild blue yonder. It was a liberating and dizzying approach, exploring the city with a theoretical map that simply had a splash of color on it, and it required a kind of act of faith. With Born Confused, I had a much more mapped out outline. This one, there was a lot of winging it going on. And so like Dimple with her photography, my modus operandi, my unmapping map while writing this book became this: to follow a color all the way through and just see what that would lead to. In loosening the coordinates in this way, I also fell upon what became one of the main themes of the book, the idea that there is no place like home because home is not a place. It's a sense of sanctuary which you may find in a person, a place, a moment, a memory. It's a direction, really, more than a destination. And my own motherland had been redefined in a very literal sense. And the greatest challenges in writing Bombay Blues were having chosen to write a book set almost entirely in a city I barely knew, in a country I didn't live in, and at this point, as the mother of a small child and a baby, my elder daughter was 5 and my little one was 1 when I first began work on Bombay Blues, and my first trip to Bombay was soon after that for the book. So with Born Confused, I drew upon my years of living in New York, which was made easier to do once I was based in London writing it. In a way, Born Confused was an examination of the sort of answer I'd arrived at because of those experiences, and was an expression of a known, an owning of, an understanding of my own lived history. Bombay Blues was an entirely different process. Diving so fully into the unknown, it became part of me. Each of my 3 visits to Bombay for my book radically changed my story. Each moment spent, each person met, experience, conversation, significant silence even. And then came the magical turning point when the world of my book gained enough momentum that it seemed to be shaping the very city itself, art imitating life, imitating art to the point of no imitation, just realization. In Bombay Blues, Dimple is struggling to follow her heart and her art, to reconcile her known world with the unknown world she plunges into with her camera. Similarly, during the writing of it, more than trying to reconcile any physical places or cultural spaces, I was trying to reconcile motherhood with writerhood, freedom with often necessary constraints. And it turns out, with a frock of a lot of work, commitment, and ideally, crucially, an extra set of helping childcare hands, and very, very, very little sleep, they can be part and parcel of the same space. And just one more note on the topic of landscape and setting. Whereas with Born Confused, writing about New York was like making a record of a lived experience, interestingly and fittingly with Bombay Blues, it was more an experience of a land-escape than a landscape. Because in a way, the Bombay that I was looking for and that I'd been working, so hard for 3 years to find my connection to, slipped my fingers the moment I had fully written about it. Or rather, the Bombay I was looking for turned out to be the Bombay in my book, returning that metropolis in a way to being a mythical city, a city of memory, from mapping it out to unmapping it, which brought me full circle back to the very point I'd started from. So with Born Confused, I explored a kind of answer I'd arrived at about cross-cultural identity. With Bombay Blues, I lived and still in a state of arriving at a question. Thanks.
That's fascinating. Many of the questions that I had while reading your books and some of the thoughts that I had are things that you touched on. We're now going to our last presenter before we get to the question and answer period, and that is Michael Williams. Michael is a writer by night. His day job is running the very successful Cape Town Opera in South Africa. The Cape Town Opera is currently on tour in the UK, which is the reason, I believe, that we're finding Michael joining us from London. After reading an article about what the managing director of an opera company does, I have no idea how he has time to write on the side or in the evenings, but he's managed to write 10 books. His 2 most recent ones are for teens, although he does write for adults as well. And these, the ones that you see on the screen, are about the devastation and violence that's occurring in some countries in Africa these days, the exploitation of children, the effects on children who see their families killed, their homes burned, and they have no alternative but to flee their homeland. Many of whom wind up in South Africa, where the country where Michael lives. So I'll let Michael tell you a lot more about these books, and especially I think he'll focus on his last one, Diamond Boy, or its forthcoming one, I should say. Michael.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here to be talking about my first passion, which is writing and telling stories. Now is the Time for Running was a book that was written because a publisher friend of mine said, young men don't read, Michael. Write something that young men will read. And so the challenge was set for me to create a story about two brothers that travel from Zimbabwe, the 14-year-old Dio and his mentally handicapped 23-year-old brother, who, after the devastation of their village, traveled to South Africa to find their father, and along the way experience xenophobic violence and adventure and heartbreak. And the story was driven by the fact that I wanted to write something that you couldn't put down, something that would just leap from the pages. And it was very interesting to see the response that I got from letters, particularly from one Madeline in New Hampshire, who wrote to me a 3-page red letter in an envelope that arrived at my door. And letters are very rare things. And she was incensed that I had ended the book the way I had, and she wanted to know far more than the book had actually given her. And she wrote so many questions that it forced me to consider the possibility of writing something along the same veins. And when I approached the publishers, Pam Gruber said to me, well, Michael, why don't you consider writing not a sequel, but why not a companion piece? Create that universe that you created, and now is the time for running. And so Diamond Boy began its journey thanks to a red letter from one of my readers. And essentially, I looked at Now is the Time for Running and took one character from that book that came and went, and I don't quite know why he was in the book in the first place, but I do know now that he is the central figure of Diamond Boy. His name is Patson. He lives in Zimbabwe. He goes to a school in Harare, and while he's in the school, he experiences the poverty that many Zimbabweans experience. And so what he wants to do is he wants his family to experience something different. And so he forces his father to consider the possibility that he's failing as a teacher. And Diamond Rush has begun in Marenge. And so the family set out to Marenge to go and look for diamonds. What's very interesting is, of course, that diamonds could be picked up off the ground. It's called alluvial diamond mining. And what happens to Patson and his family in the diamond mines of Zimbabwe is really what the story is about, and how he travels to look for his sister is a part of the Odyssey. And so the book really deals with Africa. It deals with a system in Zimbabwe which is really quite terrible in terms of what is happening to people there. And also it's a book about greed and temptation. What would you do if you had 3 perfect diamonds? And how would that change your life if you could be a millionaire at a stroke of just picking up a stone, and that could change your life? How would that change you as a person? What would you sacrifice to possess 3 perfect diamonds? And so that's really what the book is about. And it's a book that deals with family love. It's a book that deals with the landscape of Africa. And it's a book that deals with greed. What do we do when we are greedy? So I've just given you some idea of some of the landscape that I was dealing with. When I write, I like to be able to look at pictures and imagine what it's like when you see these people. So here is a photograph of some of the diamonds working the fields, and you can see the kind of conditions of the school that they're in, the sheds that they would live in along the diamond mines, the kind of life they would have working, the tools that they use. It's a very hard life, but of course the promise of that tiny little stone in that person's hands can change somebody's life. And look at the fact that everybody is mining. It's not just men and women, it's boys, it's girls, it's a whole family, it's aunties and mothers. And of course what happened in Zimbabwe was that the Zimbabwean army came and took over the camps and forced all of these people into some sort of slave labor. And so the book is partially linked to real incidences, but at the same time, of course, it is a work of fiction with the backdrop. That's one of my favorite images. I see that as Patson scouring for his diamond in the waters of the Basha River. Another image of young people working. And then, of course, when the army came in, they killed a lot of the miners. And then, of course, they realized that they don't know how to mine. And so they used the captured miners to mine for them. So I think that's my time up. I'll turn back to you, Susan.
Okay, thank you. I really enjoyed looking at those photographs. Maybe if we have a little time at the end, we could come back to some of those. Well, I haven't seen any questions coming in. There was one question, but I haven't been able to access it yet. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask Elizabeth, what kind of response, Elizabeth, have you had from teen readers to Blue Gold? Because in this book, Fiona, the Canadian girl, takes an activist stance. In fact, if I could make a comment, I really appreciated the way you've given agency to each of the young women in this story. Sylvie, from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, has a choice whether or not to become the poster girl. And she decides that she will. Despite her scarred face, she'll allow them to use her picture, the people who are protesting in Canada, about the political violence and the fact that Canadians are allowing for economic purposes those people to be exploited. And it was a huge step for her. Then in China, Lai Ping becomes friends with somebody and actually becomes open to the idea of resistance. We don't have, nothing is resolved, but we have the idea that she will actually form part of a resistance group and take agency for her own situation. And Sylvie, we understand that she's moved from a position of victim to an activist. I'm wondering if you've had any response from Canadian children whose activism has been spurred. I'll let you answer right now.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you for taking such time to the novel so well. To be honest with you, the novel has been out since January. I have not had direct response from classrooms, so it's hard for me to gauge that, how young people are receiving the book. I guess many writers fall into this trap, but I'll confess that I do check Goodreads quite often. And I've been very interested to see the range of reaction there, going from, this is a terrible book, it talks about things that children should not be exposed to, don't read it, don't give it to your children, to, I would like to think, more enlightened points of view that recognize, although it's a very dark and disturbing story, it is important for young people to be exposed to these things. Yeah, I wish I had more feedback from young people. As I say, it's just been 2, 3, or 4 months since it's been out, so I hope to get more response and see where we go with that. There's a lot of wonderful choice out there for teen readers, and I have very dear friends who write wonderful, entertaining, and funny books. That is not necessarily what this book is, but I really strive to make each character real and authentic, and to have her own story, and to give each character something that any young person around the world could connect to. Back to you, Susan.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask you one more question, Elizabeth, while we're on this topic. Since the writing of this book, has Canada signed a bill regarding the use of conflict-free materials in manufacturing goods that they bring into Canada? Do you happen to know?
I have to say that I am no authority on politics or legislation, but my understanding is that the government has introduced legislation. I do not believe it's been passed through our parliament yet, but the government has introduced legislation that would require companies, especially targeting mining companies, to be open about their financial dealings with foreign governments. There has been an issue with bribes, I guess, there's no other way to put it, in some countries around the world where Canadian mining companies are very active. So that step has been taken, but to my knowledge, no. I know the United States has legislation requiring companies like Apple to ensure that their chain of supply respects human rights from the source of the minerals, Africa or wherever, to the manufacturing process in China or again wherever. But not to my knowledge in Canada, no. Over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to Kat now. Kat, you told us a lot about how these books originated in your mind, what the various threads were that came together for you creating that world. And I'm wondering, you have so many descriptions of Milanese food. I'm wondering if you yourself are a cook, or are you just a good eater?
I'm a cook and a good eater. I think that not only am I in love with food from so many different cultures, but also with Italian food, it is so much a part of the culture. It is so much an expression of love and history for the Italian people, at least in my experience of them, that it felt really important to include it in the book. Although honestly, I think every novel I write is going to have what people are eating and why it tastes so fabulous. So, I mean, that's just going to be part of the story. In particular, family recipes. In so many cultures, there's, of course, family recipes like different desserts are made in certain ways in India or in Palestine or in Italy. And just having that connection back down through history, I think, is really interesting, too. So the food did play it was kind of a character of its own. Over to you, Susan.
Tanuja, I have a couple of questions to address to you. And one has to do with your use of language. I really loved, as I was reading, the way you play with language. It's often very poetic, and it's got puns in it. It's full of puns. Some I catch, maybe many I didn't catch. And numerous literary allusions and cultural allusions from all areas of culture, popular culture, etc. It sounds like you had a lot of fun with this. I'm wondering if this is part of your style. it crosses over also with the way the mother, with the way that Dimple's mother says things like altu, faltu, or and she kind of plays with language too. Can you just discuss this a little bit?
Yeah, I was definitely having fun with all of that in the book. I think part of it maybe comes from the songwriting, writing lyrics and melodies, and I think that there's a lot of cross feed between my prose and the music, and as well I was writing the songs based on the book at the same time that I was writing the book. So in some instances, I pulled lines directly from the book into lyrics in a song. Like there's a song called Chor Bazaar on the album. There's also a scene set in Chor Bazaar, and the verses came from the book, but then when I developed the chorus for the song, I worked that back into the book, and this kind of interweaving happened throughout the process as revising was going on in both areas. So I think that's part of it, and I just love language. I mean, I think the Thesaurus is the most beautiful book in the world, except for everyone's books in this panel today. It's really like the Thesaurus is just one of my favorite books. I love playing with language and pushing it, pulling it closer. I love the musicality of it, how, whether you em-dash or you colon or you comma or you ellipsify changes the rhythm and the music of the sentence that you're working on, even the word. And the roots of words and how their very history is contained within them. And when you recombine words, when you invent words, you create a little story within each of those words themselves as well. And for example, blue comes from, one of the roots of blue is belle eau, which is beautiful water, French for beautiful water. But there are also some theories that there's a partly Indo origin of the word blue, and that's bel, B-H-E-L, to shine, to burn, to mix. And there were things like that where actually, my kind of cultural spaces were more intertwined than I realized in the language itself. Dungaree is a word of South Asian origin. Shampoo is a word of South Asian origin. Punch, the drink, comes from the South Asian word punch, which means 5, because punch had 5 ingredients when it was created. So I find like even in one word you can kind of discover other angles to your story just through exploring the etymology. And as far as literary allusions, that's also, I just feel like they bring a whole world with them as well. And there's some references to the Odyssey and Ulysses in Bombay Blues because of their, themes of home and homecoming. And Paris Spleen, which is Baudelaire's prose poem to Paris, that's kind of the reference that I was thinking of when I thought about the title Bombay Spleen for the album. Actually, that was going to be the title of the book and became the title of the album. And I didn't consciously set out to do this, but I think that all the embedded puns and allusions of this sort, some of which I may have missed myself, so don't feel bad about that, Susan. They may have just come out. I'm not sure I even know what they all are, but because they kind of just come in the flow. But I feel like in a way they're a sort of map of Dimple's mind and history as she's actually mapping out the city of Bombay. And people are always navigating in this way and trying to make sense of the space you're in by drawing on where you've been, who you've been, what you've read, the music we've listened to, the books we've read, the people we've known, and in a way filling the text with these sorts of little clues to what, I don't know. Maybe it can simulate for the reader the experience that Dimple has in Bombay as she sets off amassing clues to a what that she's not quite sure of either. She's kind of on a treasure hunt but isn't sure of what the treasure is, and the hunt, of course, ends up being the treasure. Back to you.
Sorry for the delay. I was just reading some of the questions that are coming in. I'm interested in addressing them, but I think I'll ask one more of Michael while I organize the questions, if you don't mind. Michael, I noticed that Now is the Time for Running was first published in South Africa before it had an American publisher. And that was, 2 years ago, I think. But it had been published 2 years prior to that in South Africa. From the copyright information on Diamond Boy, and from what you said earlier, it looks as if you worked, or it is true that you worked directly with your American editor at Little Brown on this book. Now, conversely, would you expect this book to be published in South Africa? Yeah, I guess that's my question.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, the book was first published, Now is the Time for Running, in South Africa, and then Little Brown picked it up. And this time around with Diamond Boy, it's going to be published in December by Little Brown. My publishers in South Africa will be doing a shortened version of the same novel, and that publication will be coming out in January and February in South Africa, dedicated to the schools market, because they really believe that the book will work very well in grade 10 and 11, and so they're preparing a book. It's been quite interesting having to cut 20,000 words from the South African edition, which sends a shiver down my spine when it comes to recrafting the story. But in terms of getting it into schools in South Africa, it's as important to me as to publishing it in America.
Yes, I can imagine that parts of this book would be fairly controversial in South Africa. So, on the other hand, will be very necessary, very, very important. So it's nice to hear that it will be being read in a school setting. I have a question for Tanuja from, just a moment, Antonio Gonzalez, possibly. Just a moment, I have, part of the name is cut off. Sorry, Antonio. Tanuja, what surprised you most about Dimple as she evolved from book 1 to book 2?
That is a very interesting question. What surprised me most about Dimple? I think although she was somewhat adventurous in book 1, I think in book 2, her decision to have a very sort of physical and spontaneous experience of Bombay, in a way, surprised me. She's still quite an introspective, thinking character, but quite early on in the book, she decides to, get her hands dirty, and she's been at college for a couple of years at university. She's kind of hit a standstill in her work and feels like everything is always being analyzed to death, and why does she have to read so much about what she wants to do? Why can't she just kind of go out there and do it? And I think her willingness to let go of a lot of those tools surprised me a bit. And again, I bring it back, as the writer, I bring it back a bit to motherhood, because I feel like that's a very physical experience. It's an exhilarating experience. It's completely exhausting. And you do have to learn to let go in a lot of ways. It's a funny tango, actually. You sort of need to learn to let go while holding on. Children are, these little creatures are huge creatures. They're incessantly demanding. They're constantly inspiring. They're very frustrating. They're very absorbing. And it's a heightening experience and a very humbling experience as well to become a parent. And I think that realizing that you really can't control everything. I mean, I think Dimple probably knew that before. I probably knew that before. But sometimes you really can't control anything when you've got little people in the house. I think that worked its way into Dimple's story, like from my experience as a mother to her experience in Bombay, and sort of just letting go and going with the flow and allowing herself to get lost and in some cases not even trying to get found, just sort of having that experience of being lost and losing her coordinates. I think that was maybe the surprise. And the big.
Thank you for that. Another question that has come in is really for any of you who want to address it. I don't know. Perhaps I'll call on either Kat or Elizabeth. This is raising an issue that has been talked about a lot in the United States. Maggie Block asks, or comments perhaps, while I want authors to tell stories outside of their experience, I wonder what you think could be done to encourage more authors of color. And then I can't read the rest of the sentence. For some reason, I'm not able to open that. But more authors of color from other countries, perhaps, or from the United States, to write some of these stories. Elizabeth, would you like to try that?
Thanks, Susan. Wow, that's a tough one. I think the question may be revolving around the issue of appropriation of culture, and this is something I have struggled with both of my books. My first novel was about the lynching of a First Nations boy, although it was told from the point of view of a white settler. Still, I knew I was encroaching on a story that was very sacred to this particular First Nation. And in the case of Blue Gold, I was imposing myself all over the world, in the eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, China. Of course, one character was in Vancouver. It would be a wonderful thing if people of color wrote about what's important to them, but I guess as a writer, I defend with all respect my right to inhabit any human being, to express myself through an empathy that is the basis of creating character. I hope that's an answer. I'm going to hand it back to you. Susan?
Yes, it is an answer. Is there anyone else who'd like to chime in on this? If so, take over. Otherwise, I'll move on.
Hi, I'd love to answer this. I also would be very interested to hear what Tanuja has to say about this. I think that there's a number of ways that we can encourage. I certainly take every opportunity I can when I meet young writers of color to encourage them, well, all writers of color really. It's been a big question in the conference that I attend yearly, and so we're really focusing on that right now, reaching out to people. But I also would say, if there are any writers of color listening, or any potential writers of color listening, that I would encourage you to write for at least a couple of really important reasons. One, you will probably save lives, and I do not mean this metaphorically. My own life was certainly saved by Ursula K. Le Guin and Jane Austen, but you may save lives among your own people because you're writing experiences that may release them from their own difficulties. The other thing I would say is write what you want to write, because no matter where you're from, a lot of headway's been made. We've got Amy Tan, we've got Sherman Alexie, we've got Louise Erdrich, we've got a lot of really interesting people out there writing their experiences. So if you need to write about bunnies in outer space, we also need writers of every color writing about what it is that they love, so that we have this vaster experience available to us. And then once you've published those bunnies in outer space stories, everyone knows that they can do that too. You can be a Navajo and not write about the Diné experience, if you know what I mean. And again, I'd love to hear what Tanuja has to say. Thank you very much.
Hi. No, am I on? I absolutely. Yeah, it's Tanuja. Sorry, I'm switching. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think for me, with Born Confused, with my first book, one of the things that I wanted to do in writing that book is get that South Asian American, that particular shade of brown girl story onto a bookshelf. And one thing I had wondered about, I didn't wonder about it growing up, but in later years I wondered what kind of a difference it would have made to have books on my bookshelf growing up with characters who were more like my family and like the places where they were from, to have more people who looked like us on screen, in film and television and advertising, broadcasting the news, etc. And that's not to say I didn't absolutely love Jane Austen as well, and Charles Dickens, and all of these great writers. But I just wondered what that kind of would have done in terms of feeling a different sense of kind of being valued and part of the culture at large. When I was growing up, we were always taking off other on forums because they'd have sort of Asian, Pacific Islander, all these different categories, and I could never, I'm quite geographically challenged anyways, but as far as I could see, I wasn't from any of those places on the map. I was from the room that I was in filling my form out in. So anyway, so for me, that's what I did with the first book. With the second one, although obviously it deals with culture because it's an Indian American character in India, and I'm still very interested in those things, I did want to move beyond that, and the color I ended up exploring is blue rather than brown, which my first book was sort of more about. And Dimple also is taking color photography in the new book. She starts out the first book taking black and white, and that was kind of my own kind of transition from feeling the need to get that story out there that deals specifically with race, and then kind of just moving beyond that and dealing more with Dimple as an artist and a young woman, and a person kind of navigating human relationships and her place in the world generally as well. And I would say as well to never underestimate the value of your own story. And sometimes I found, especially with Born Confused, I found that some of the things that seemed the most mundane to me ended up being some of the most interesting passages to readers, unless they were lying to me. I don't think they were. And these things were the things that I knew best, which is why they were sort of the mundane things for me, obviously, but they were also the things that were kind of the most organic to my experience and my cultural experience. And so I would say never underestimate that. We want to hear all of your stories. There are people who are listening. The more you tell the stories, the more people are going to listen. And do it. We want to hear you. We want to hear ourselves. We want to hear you, and just make it, it will become a beautiful song. We need every person's part, every person's musical bit, voice, lyrics, verses, all of that stuff, and we can create something, really quite amazing. And I think it's already in progress, which is quite exciting. And absolutely, I feel that as a writer, you have the right. As a writer, part of what you do is you slip into the skins of other people, whatever the color of their skins may be, and you learn a lot of empathy that way. You teach a lot of empathy that way. And when you do that, when you get below the skin, you arrive at the place where we're all really the same. The heart's beating. Hopefully, your stomach's got hopefully something in it. Maybe you've got a stomach, and that's the place where we can all meet. It's under the skin. So back to you.
We have time for barely time for one quick question. Linda Sharuz is wondering about whether Michael Williams has had any negative feedback from Zimbabwe because of his the stories that he's telling, which are based on real events. Michael, can you give us a short answer, and then I believe our time is up.
Yes, I do agree with all the previous speakers around the issue of appropriation, and certainly the writer's right to write what he wishes. And to that scale, I think one has to be very careful as a writer to get as much feedback as possible from people that you can trust. And so I gave my book to several Zimbabweans to read in its draft form and across the spectrum, and I got very positive feedback. So the book hasn't come out yet to a wider audience, but certainly to the 6 readers, Zimbabwean readers that I gave, I got a very positive feedback that the book was accurate and true and sad in parts and joyous in others. So there you go. Thank you, Susan.
Uh-huh. Well, we're past the time for questions. We're at the time of wrapping this up. So I want to remind everybody that you can see what has been said here as an archived webcast in about 72 hours. I want to thank all of the panelists. You did a wonderful job. You've written wonderful books, and I urge all of those in attendance, if you haven't read the books, go out and read them. Thanks again for attending today, and do be sure to visit our sponsors and thank them for sharing their authors and their illustrators with us today. Thank you, and goodbye.